Welcome to the West End Video Newsletter. My name is Joel Piccolo, Assistant Editor of the West End Newsletter. I'm your host for today's show. We have a real interesting show today. We're going to take you back in a little time of history of Boston to old Scollay Square. Boston is noted, if you read the history books, Boston is noted for baked beans and Paul Revere and the Constitution and things like that. But everybody remembers old Scollay Square. Today's guest for the show today is David Kruh, author and historian. David's done a lot of work on Scollay Square and has done a lot of research. David, can you tell us how you first got interested in the old Scollay Square?
It all began for me the way it did for, I suppose, a lot of young men who are not from Boston. I'm from New York originally, and I had gotten a job in Boston back in 1981, went back home for a visit with the family, and an uncle of mine was there. He happened to be a doctor in the U.S. Navy during World War II. And he said, "Oh, you're in Boston now, eh?" I said, "So tell me, how are things in Scollay Square?" And I'd never heard of the place. This was 1981. The square had been gone for almost 20 years. And I said, "I've never heard of it." And he said, "Oh, let me tell you." He said, "The ship used to pull into port into Charlestown during the war, and the commanding officer, the CO, would get on the intercom and say, 'Okay, man, it's Liberty time in Boston. You've earned it. Just remember the rules. And rule number one is, don't go to Scollay Square.'" So naturally, where's the first place all the sailors went was Scollay Square. So my uncle, who was a doctor in the Navy, spent the rest of his shore leave patching up all the guys that got into fights down at the Imperial House in Scollay Square. That got me curious enough to want to find out where the place was. And when I got back to Boston, I discovered that it had been torn down. And that started a 6-year search for photographs, memories, and it was about 3 or 4 years ago that I realized there are no other books written about the subject. There is a novel published in 1951 by a woman named Pearl Schiff called Scollay Square, but there have never been any books written about the history of Scollay Square.
Where did you get a lot of your materials from?
From people. I've put together a slideshow, which I give at community centers and historical societies, and I always bring a tape recorder because inevitably when the slideshow is done, sometimes in the middle of the slideshow, somebody will raise their hand and say, "Oh, I got to tell you a great story about Scollay Square." Going to the Boston Public Library, as again, there are no books on Scollay Square, I simply went to the books on Boston history and picked out these scant little paragraphs or maybe a line or two, and I began to discover that the history of Scollay Square is truly, it's an amazing history when you consider that George Washington slept there. I mean, I guess every history has to have a George Washington slept there story, and Scollay Square has one. Hancock and Otis and Adams worked and prayed and lived there. You had some medical, theological, scientific advances, all of these incredible things happening next door to, sometimes on the same site as, the same place where Sally Keith tossed her tassels and Ann Corio first stepped on the stage of the Old Howard.
The Old Howard, right.
Of course, which is, of course, one of the biggest draws of old Scollay Square was, of course, the Old Howard.
How about Joanie Mall? Tell us about Joanie Mall.
Oh, gosh. Well, the Joanie Mall family actually began Joanie Mall, probably the world's most famous hot dog stand, in 1909 when a fellow who had, well, as I used to say back then, gotten a woman in a family way and had to leave town very quickly, sold these two men his hot dog stand. They were barbers on Stoddard Street, which is right across the street from the Howard. And they bought the hot dog stand and began selling hot dogs. They soon bought a store on Stoddard Street, and it became very popular, partly because it was right across the street from the Howard, and a lot of the performers who would be in a rush to get in for a rehearsal or people going in for a show at the Old Howard almost inevitably stopped by Joanie Mall's for those famous nickel hot dogs and those dime beers. And Joanie Mall's quickly began a reputation of being the kind of place that you had to go to when you were in Boston.
Well, once you had a Joanie Mall hot dog, boy, that just, there was a different type of taste that you wanted to go back for more.
You know what they tell me it was? Joe Insognia, who still runs the Joanie Mall, which is right there on Bowden Street, just below the State House, he jokes around about it because they used to cook the dogs in a big cauldron of hot water, and they would also sell the hot dogs to people who wanted to buy them and take them home. And he says people would go home and they'd cook them, but they never would taste the same because they had a way of cooking them just until the skins were about to burst. And then they would, people would go home, and unfortunately they wouldn't know how to cook the hot dog, so that would keep the people coming into the store, I guess.
I remember. I used to shine shoes and sell papers at Scollay Square, and every time I was after every newspaper selling episode, here I'd take my proceeds and run right into Joanie Mall and buy a hot dog. It was great. I believe for 25 cents I got 2 or 3 hot dogs and a large drink and even dessert. And boy, I crave for them today, and I still go up to Joanie Mall every once in a while up to Bowden Street and buy them.
Everybody has a Joanie Mall story. There, you know, there's a lot of great stories about servicemen who would find themselves on a field of battle someplace. It could have been some tropical island in the South Pacific, or maybe in France, and they would meet up with somebody, and they would start talking about, you know, where you're from and, you know, where you're going to, and people would say where they're from. They'd say Boston. The first thing they'd say about Boston was Scollay Square. Now, there's a story I heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's such a great story that I love to tell it, and I put it in the book. It's about a soldier who's guarding his post on Normandy soon after the D-Day invasion, and he hears a rustling in the bushes. So he does his best, you know, halt, who goes there? And the voice from in the dark says something like, you know, it's Private Smith. And he goes, where you from, Private? He goes, I'm from Boston. He goes, where in Boston you're from? You know, I'm in Boston. I remember, what do you know about Boston? He goes, well, I know Scollay Square. What do you know about Scollay Square? He goes, I know Joanie Mall. Guard goes, okay, pass.
That's quite a story.
You know, there's a lot of little stories like that. Places like Joanie Mall seem to take on a certain character all their own. And, you know, you mentioned Scollay Square, and immediately people say, oh, the Crawford House, oh, the old Howard, oh, Joanie Mall, and they start going on about the hot dogs, and, you know, there you are. You're a former West Ender, and it's not just the West Enders who have it, but everyone's got that story.
All over the world, all over the country. Sailors and servicemen they have to come back and visit, and they come back, they want to see old Scollay Square, but it's not there. That's
it's such a unique place. When I spoke with the folks who still run Joanie Mall, you would have judges of the appellate court sitting next to parolees. You would have striptease artists and some of the great burlesque queens, and they'd be sitting next to and eating hot dogs next to a bum, or maybe even a lawyer or a government official. It was, you know, you talk about melting pots, and of course the West End is one of the great examples of one of the great melting pots, and here's this restaurant that really gives you another example of what a melting pot was really like. I mean, everybody went to Joanie Mall, and everyone sat together, and nobody complained. Everyone, I guess, was too busy eating those nickel hot dogs.
Sure. The Scollay Square was loaded with every other doorway there was a bar or a lounge or a rooming house, and it was a bustling place. It was a happy place. Even though it was all its activities there, it was a safe place. The only crime that I've ever heard about in Scollay Square was a barroom brawl. You find that in your...
It's funny you should mention that. When I ask people about Scollay Square, I almost always hear the words, it was safe. As a matter of fact, my wife's mother is a former West Ender, and one of the first things she ever told me about living in the West End in Scollay Square was the fact that sometimes at night she would have to walk through Scollay Square to get home. She never felt a single ounce of fear walking through Scollay Square. And that's something very special when you consider its reputation as a sailor's haven with the tattoo parlors, and you had the Simpsons loan office, and it's remarkable. All these places that you today would think, oh my, how dangerous it must have been, but yet it really wasn't. It almost had its own sense of community about it.
I can attest to that, because here I was 10 or 12 years old, and I sold papers there, as they say, and it was safe. I had no fear at all whatsoever about walking through Scollay Square 8 or 9 o'clock at night to help the family by selling newspapers.
And that's another reason that I think Scollay Square brings such smiles to people's faces, because like the West End, it reminds them of a time when you could walk down a city street that was unlit and not walk in fear of being mugged. it harkens back to a time when, you know, the raciest thing that a young boy did was try to sneak into the old Howard at the age of 12 years old. And gosh, how many, you know, guys have I spoken to who did that very thing? Yet we look back today and it all seems so tame when you consider what's going down on Washington Street by Essex Station. It's really quite remarkable.
David, you have some great photographs here, I see on the table. Could you explain some of them and for our viewing audience?
Well, sure. Unfortunately, the one picture I would love to show you is one of Scollay's building, which really was the beginning of Scollay Square. Scollay Square actually began as sort of a transportation center. In this photograph, you see a lot of the electric trolleys, which were installed in Boston in 1883. The interesting thing about the trolley system back then was, I mean, we think we have problems today with the central artery. By 1888, traffic was so bad with the electric trolleys, it would take them an hour to move one block down Tremont Street. The answer was to build America's first subway system, which they did in 1897, and they completed in Scollay Square in 1898. This is a photograph taken in 1898 during the subway construction of America's first subway system. And I'll take this picture away and show you what it was like in Scollay Square after they had completed that subway construction. And if you look over on the this side of the photograph, you'll see what you used to call kiosks. Some people call them pillboxes.
That was right in the middle of the square, right?
It was a marvelous example of public works projects back then, even the clockwork. Funny thing about that subway kiosk, there's a whole story that runs around this subway kiosk and a statue of John Winthrop. He was the first governor of Massachusetts. He was the leader of the first band of settlers who came to the Willamette Peninsula in 1630. In 1880, on the 250th anniversary of the founding of Boston, they put up a statue in the center of the square. That statue lasted until they built this subway kiosk. They had to move the statue down Court Street by about 50 feet, which is where it stood for about 6 years, till about 1903, 1904, when they were finishing the East Boston subway line, what we today call the Blue Line. And of course, what happened was they had to build another exit kiosk, another place for more people to get out, and it had to be put right where the statue had just been moved. So they took the statue and they finally decided to move him to the front grounds of the First and Second Church on Marlborough Street in the Back Bay. And it's funny because in my slideshow, I used to say at this point, I'd show a picture of the statue sitting there amongst the trees on Marlborough Street in the Back Bay, and I'd say, and there the statue stood all placid and calm ever since then. Well, I was giving this slideshow at the Nichols House Museum in Boston on Beacon Hill, and somebody after the show came up to me, and they said, you know, the statue's existence was not that placid after that move, because in 1968 there was a fire at the church, and the front wall of the church collapsed, knocking the statue off of the pedestal, and the head of the statue became disconnected from the body of the statue. And to further increasing dignity, the head of the statue was picked up by somebody who's trying to carry it off. They stopped the kid, I guess, and they got the statue together somehow, and it stands there now, hopefully more placid and forever in front of the church. And you can still see it there, and it's sort of a living reminder, if you will, of a piece of Scollay Square that still exists.
And the subway is no longer, there is still a subway system there, but it's no longer in the middle. It's moved off to the side of
well, they did that during the realignment of all the subway tracks during the 1962 reconstruction.
And you mentioned the traffic. I didn't realize that the traffic in those days was so heavy because there weren't many cars in those days. But
no, there weren't. Well, the reason that they had to take down the kiosk was that in the 1920s, for the rise of American affluence, more Americans had automobiles, and more cars were going through Boston. This particular part of Boston being so popular between all the stores and the theaters, you had Beacon Hill, you had the downtown section, cars coming in from the north, they had to tear down those big, beautiful kiosks because the drivers of the cars couldn't see pedestrians walking off of the kiosks, and people were in danger of being hit, and that's why they tore them down and put up those very unattractive entrances that were there until 1962.
Well, there's been so much interest brought back to Boston about Old Scollay Square. You've appeared on many TV shows and done many lectures. We're about to see some film clips of different happenings that you've put together about Scollay Square. So we're going to go off to some film clips now.
Scollay Square changed more than any other part of the city. We're looking at Scollay Square during the Civil War, around 1865. Our next shot will be the exact same view 120 years later.
And that looks a little more recognizable to a
Isn't
lot
that
of people.
incredible? Now, many streets led into Scollay Square. One of the most fascinating was Cornhill. Cornhill was actually the intellectual center of the abolitionist movement during the Civil War. William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written here, as was the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And eventually, Cornhill became known for the myriad of bookstores that were along this street. Men like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and John Kennedy are known to have gone to many of those bookstores while they went to Harvard.
I'm looking at John and Ann, and as those pictures came up, obviously you don't remember the Civil War, but they start to bring back memories, don't they?
Yes, yes.
When you walk down the street today, and on the way over here, you must have come right through, is it disappointing to see what's become?
It is to me. Yeah, all the characters.
Square was also part of the hit song of the day.
Couple of lines in the Kingston Trio's Charlie and the MTA about a poor guy who goes down and doesn't have the nickel to get off the train. Charlie's wife goes down to the Scollay Square station every day at 2:15. The Scollay Square station was part of the first subway system in America. Scollay Square began really with Tremont Row, a collection of erudite shops and dance academies. The first dentist to use anesthesia was here on Tremont Row, which eventually evolved, as Scollay Square did, into a collection of theaters. Here's the Star Theater. I know many old West Enders remember the Star Theater because the star, which was lit, used to rotate, and the kids used to get a kick out of that. Across the street, the Crawford House. Oh, this is a shot of Scollay Square in 1884, and we're looking down. You see that statue in the lower right-hand corner is where Scully's building used to stand. It was torn down in 1871 and replaced with a statue.
Now, how are we looking at it so people can relate to today?
Okay. City Hall Plaza would be on our right side, and 123 Center Plaza would be on our left side.
Oh, welcome back. That was very good, David. Those are quite good film clips we had here.
I feel bad because I didn't wear a tie for this show, and I wore it on that show.
Oh, okay. David, tell us about the Crawford House. There were many bars, as we mentioned before. There was the Silver Dollar Bar. One of the more famous ones, the Crawford House. Tell us a little bit about the history.
Well,
of
the Crawford House is part of that part of Scollay Square's history that sort of has two sides to it. You have the George Washington slept here kind of history, because Daniel Webster stayed there. It had the first passenger elevator in the country, was installed at the Crawford House. I spoke to one former West Ender who remembers her father working at the Mass General. This is 1914. Her being taken to the hospital to visit her dad at work, and then, as she recalls it, in her Mary Jane's, being taken to the Crawford House for tea. But you'll find 20 years later, in the 1930s, people are going to the Crawford House because of a woman named Sally Keyes, whose reputation was a bit less erudite. She was, of course, known as the Queen of the Tassels. And, I mean, here we are, we're talking about the same place where Daniel Webster stayed in the 1800s, the early mid-1800s, and then now we're talking about a woman whose status was legendary because she could make her breasts move in opposite directions. I mean, this is the kind of this is what really fascinated me about Scollay Square. People, you know, when you mention Scollay Square, people give you that little leer and that little kind of nudge, and oh, Scollay Square, and they'll tell you a sailor story or a tattoo story, of which I've heard some buttes. But then I'll tell them about the fact that Thomas Edison worked on and perfected his first patented invention in Scollay Square. That Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson first heard the sound of the human voice in Scollay Square.
You hear that? That started in Scollay Square.
Everything started in Scollay Square. And then the fact that William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist newspaper editor, had his office on Cornhill, which was the street that is now sort of half there with the old Sears Crescent building. And
there were many bookstores on Cornhill, wasn't there?
That's the other thing about Cornhill. I mean, you went from the abolitionist movement having its intellectual center here on Cornhill. I mean, Harry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin here on Cornhill, and several lines of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. William Lloyd Garrison was dragged from Cornhill twice by angry mobs that tarred and feathered him. I mean, here is this intellectual center, and of course it died off after the Civil War, and eventually Cornhill evolved into this collection of used bookstores and magazine shops, where men such as Thomas Edison, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, have all been reported and have written down in diaries as such, having gone into these old bookstores and picked up rare manuscripts.
Speaking about books, David, you just have completed a book. Tell us a little bit
Say,
about that.
Reverend. Well, I have completed a book. It's called, tentatively, Scollay Square in the Old Howard, and it's the thing I'm hoping for, and maybe if there are some bright and willing editors out there, the book is sitting with a publisher right now, and the hard part is convincing a publisher that we can sell more than X thousand number of books. I'm, of course, a little too close to the project and a little too biased. I'm thinking, oh, wow, we can sell thousands of these books. And what we're doing now is, I guess, punching in the numbers and trying to decide if we can actually get this book in print. It would be, of course, wonderful to see it personally, and also, historically, I'd like to see the story of Scollay Square finally put together in one volume.
Oh,
because
so
right
much
now,
history there.
there is so much history, and it is more than just tassels and hot dogs and strippers. Even though all that stuff is in the book, it's also about what is happening today. We have the upcoming depression of the Central Artery. We have the redefining of the cultural district in Midtown Boston. And the questions we have to ask ourselves are, what is going to happen when these projects are completed? You know, the one architect described the new government center in 1961 as being the next St. Peter's Square of Boston. It'll be this great place where crowds will come and people will walk and children will play. And the truth is it couldn't be further from the truth. 5 o'clock comes, all the federal, city, and state workers and the private offices, they close up shop, and there is no reason to go to government center. It's a barren, red brick wasteland.
Exactly.
And the other lesson of Scollay Square, and hopefully another reason that I'd like to see this book published, is for people to realize that we have to think ahead about what's going to happen. I know that you and others are involved in a new committee called Can Do, which involves the depression of the Central Artery and what's going to happen to all that property up there. Let's look back, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look back at the West End and Scollay Square and the South End streets and learn from our mistakes and maybe build a better Boston from what has happened previously. Because I don't think anyone who's walked through Government Center today can honestly say that has any of the character, any of the draw that Scollay Square ever did.
Well, I'll be your first customer. I'm dying to read that book because it's
Okay,
it's
he's on
really going to be
tape
great.
the same.
Another thing I remember about Scollay Square is there were many theaters there. And one of the theaters I remember was the Scollay Square Theater, later known as the Scratch House. Can you tell us a little bit about
Well,
that?
actually, the Scully's Olympia, which was built in 1912, has an architectural significance. It was the first building ever built in Boston using steel-reinforced concrete. Conversely, by the way, to just drop the subject for a second, a block or two away you have the Ames Building, which was the last building in Boston to be built without using steel-reinforced concrete. And it still stands today, and if you stand in front of it, you can still see the cantilevered concrete structure stacked one on top of the other. So it's a little interesting thing right there in Scollay Square. Scully's Olympia, anyway, was built in 1912. Next door was the Star Theater, which was built a few years before that. And the Star Theater is what eventually became known as the Rialto, which most people know as the Scratch House.
Exactly.
Because apparently during the Depression, it was something of a de facto boarding house. A lot of the vagrants and the people who didn't have a place to live, they'd pay their dime to get into the movie theater and would get to sleep there all night. And
that was open 24 hours a day.
And if you were unlucky enough to sit in a seat where one of those vagrants had been and they had not had a shower in a while, well, you ended up scratching yourself, and that's where they got the name the Scratch House.
That's
Not the
really
most pleasant memory, but it's one of those things that when you mention Scollay Square, people, they laugh about it now.
Well, today's Scollay Square is a combat zone. I think there are a few scratch houses left down there.
I don't like it when people say that. A lot of people who don't know Boston, I know we're always looking for an analogy. We're always looking for something to compare it to. It's sort of like comparing an R-rated movie with an X-rated movie, or like comparing radio with television. I mean, radio back then, I'm a big fan of the old-time radio programs, the Jack Benny's and the Fred Allens and Lone Rangers, and you had to use your mind, you had to visualize, much like the strippers or the striptease artists up on stage. They never really totally disrobed. It was always a quick move here, a little tease there, the spotlight would be just the right color. They would quickly run off stage as they drop their clothing, and all the boys in the audience would go, "Did we see it? Did we see that certain part of her anatomy?" You never were really sure, and like radio, you would have to use your mind. The combat zone, unfortunately, has been reduced to this X-rated pornography, and it's like television. There's no guesswork at all. There it is. There's no imagination left, and it takes a lot. I don't want to say romance because I would be over-romanticizing Scollay Square, because it was, I don't want to get too romantic about it, because I know that it was not obviously the greatest place in the world. You did not bring the wife and kids there on a Friday evening.
But you might have met your wife there.
Well, you know the old joke about the old man who tells his son, don't go to the old Howard because you might see something that you're not supposed to see.
Exactly.
And the kid sneaks into the Howard and he does see something he's not supposed to see. It's this old man sitting in the front row of the old Howard.
A good part of the entertainment of the old Howard was the vaudeville acts that preceded the strip shows.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many of them I believe, but a lot of the men I speak to swear that they went to the old Howard for the comedians. I myself would have probably gone to hear the Candy Butchers. Those are the men and women, the men who would stand up there and hawk pieces of candy in the boxes that would contain a $50 bill for some lucky boy or girl who would spend the quarter for this box of candy. And, of course, they always had one of their compatriots, one of the other Candy Butchers, sitting in the audience. And what is this? We have a man. Oh, he's won a $50 bill. Look at that, and you can, too. So they'd sell a lot of pieces of candy, which, you'd open up the box, yeah, with pieces of candy, no $50 bill. Some great performers started the old Howard. Abbott and Costello, Weber and Fields, Red Skelton, Milton Berle.
Those are some names from the past.
And Fred Allen wrote a whole section in his autobiography all about his days in the old Howard stage.
And many of the school kids used to sneak off, skip school and go to the old Howard. And I remember one day some of my schoolmates did that, and here who was sitting in the front row but the guidance counselor. So I think there was not much of that. Dave, you have some more pictures here. Can you explain some more of these pictures? It's interesting.
Well, people want to know why Scollay Square was torn down. After World War II, in which the soldiers and the sailors, they made pretty good work of old Scollay Square. And in the 1950s, as the government began taking money away from the Navy and putting money into the Air Force, places like the Charlestown Navy Yard were scaled down. Scollay Square lost a lot of its patronage. Also, during the 1950s, people were moving into the suburbs, and Scollay Square, like a lot of Boston's inner city, began to lose a lot of its lure. By 1961, if you can believe this or not, the property values in Scollay Square were less than what they were during the Depression. That's how bad things were. So when federal money began to pour in under the early 1960s, mayors Collins and Hines put together a package along with Edward Loeb that would rebuild a certain part of the city. And they chose Scollay Square to place this new government center. I like to think today that maybe what they would have done is refurbish the buildings.
That would have been great.
Certainly have kept the old Howard, which was one of the original plans, till somebody, until the day the Howard Theater was accidentally burned.
Okay. In 1987, they had a big, huge rally in what's now called Government Center, which was old Scollay Square. And there were many of the old vaudeville people come back.
It was wonderful. It was all began actually with Jerry Williams of WRKO Radio. He's a talk show host, and sitting in Government Center Plaza one day after Boston Celtics rally, he said, "I think it's time we change the name of the city, this part of the city, back to Scollay Square." He started the campaign. Mayor Ray Flynn was running for re-election that year, and it seemed like the perfect combination for the two. And so they had this wonderful rededication ceremony on April 29th, 1987.
And next we're going to go to some clips. Here's some film clips of that rededication of old Scollay Square.
Remember old Scollay Square. All the dancing girls were there.
We want to see the girls, that's all. We just, anything that risque. It's great.
The famous politicians were there.
Joanie Mall's, the old Howard, and then there was the Imperial Hotel.
grinding shoes, selling papers, having fun, the penny arcades, everything. It was great.
Things really changed here back in the early 60s. That's when they raised this area and renamed it Government Center. One of the few remaining landmarks is the old Gold Teapot.
There are other landmarks, too, including this old subway sign and this sign outside the Red Hat Saloon. Folks who used to live in this area campaigned for years to change the name back to Scollay Square. They even wrote a song, and they finally succeeded. Today, a new name and a new sign unveiled.
Now you've got your name back. Yeah, and we're all back together. This is all West Enders. It's just great. It's great. I think those of us who lived in this area, it will bring back very good memories.
The name change will have little effect on the area, except for a new street sign and subway signs. But West End residents won the battle. An old friend is back to stay. Diana Williams, The New England News at Scollay Square.
Crawford House torn down, new buildings all around. Remember old Scollay Square.
Boy, this is old Scollay Square. This has been nostalgic and fun, and I hope we've brought back a lot of memories to many, many people who remember Scollay Square. David, you've been really great. You've been a great guest, and it's been fun. Thank you for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, great. And thank you for being here.